This is a special report from True Crime Today and the Hidden Killers podcast.
From the Hidden Killers podcast, I'm Stacy Cole. Brian Kohberger was back in court for a hearing on a potential change of venue for his capital murder trial. Let's go now to the courtroom.
CR 2922-2805. Sorry for the delay. I think we had to adjust some mics, make sure everybody can hear. And counsel and Mr. Kohberger are here in the courtroom, so we're ready to go forward. Next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. We will call Dr. Anani L. Alili.
All right, thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Please raise your right hand.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give in this case shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under penalty of perjury?
I do.
All right, thank you. Please have a seat, and then please state your name and spell your name.
My name is Anani L. Alili. Last name is E-L-A-L-A-Y-L-I.
Thank you. Ms. Taylor.
Thank you. Good morning. I can see you brought some papers to the witness stand with you today. Will you identify what those are?
Yeah, it's just copies of the slides. It's nothing. None of them in case I couldn't see.
Okay. And the slides, does that refer to the PowerPoint presentation that you for us to share today?
It does.
Okay. At this time, will you place that document in front of you face down? And if you have difficulty seeing the slides, let me know and we'll have you turn it over so you can track and help us understand what you're going to teach us today, okay?
Sure.
All right.
Yeah, I want to make sure then the state has stipulated to admit that.
That's correct.
Slides. Okay, thank you. So all of the slides that we might be considering today, you agree to?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Judge. Will you tell us what you do for work?
I'm a professor at Eastern Washington University.
What do you teach?
I teach social psychology, which is the study of how people interact with each other and influence each other, how we're all affected by social situations.
I'm going to ask you some questions so that I can understand your background that led to your ability to teach. But I want to know if you're here today in your capacity as a professor or in your separate role as an expert consultant.
I'm here as my separate role as a consultant. So what I'll be talking about today is based on my expert opinion, based on the research I've conducted and what I've learned about in the field, and it's not affiliated with the university.
Thank you for that. Now let's go to your education. What degrees do you hold?
So I have a bachelor's in psychology, and I have a master's and PhD in social and personality psychology, with a focus on social psychology.
What does that mean, a focus on social psychology?
So our area, like I mentioned, it studies how we interact with and influence each other, the power of the situation and how it affects us, like how we're all behaving differently here than in our living rooms. It includes things like how people influence us to purchase things, like I teach a class on social influence, or influence us to donate money. And then my specific area of focus is on social cognition, which is how we select, remember, and interpret social information.
How long have you been teaching?
I have been teaching since before I graduated with my PhD, so since the late 90s. But I started my positions as a professor in 2002.
2002?
2002 at University of Florida, 2003 at Eastern Washington University.
In your role as a professor and a professional, have you written articles and been published?
I have.
How many, roughly?
Roughly 15, give or take.
Do any of those relate to human bias?
Yes, most of them. So a lot of them are focused centrally on bias, and then many of the others are tangentially related to bias. So it could be biased perceptions of ourselves, how we tend to overestimate ourselves in a lot of ways. It includes biased impressions of individuals, like you might take one thing about a person and make a whole bunch of conclusions about them when you don't know them, and that could influence how you perceive their behavior later on. It includes biased perceptions of groups, so stereotyping and prejudice. And I've also studied biased impressions of businesses.
Have you consulted as an expert in other cases besides Mr. Kohberger's case?
Yes, I consulted in a case around 2016 or so, and then I was involved in the non-dissemination hearing here as well for Mr. Kohberger's case.
So you're telling us that you testified before Mr. Kohberger's case. Is that correct?
Correct.
And have you testified as an expert in any other hearings besides that one for Mr. Kohberger?
For Mr. Kohberger, no, just that one.
How about other people?
Yes, one for, and the case I didn't eke it out. I have a full-time job, plenty to do, but I've been asked to do expert testimony, and I feel like it's the right thing to do to share what I know about bias.
Thank you for that. What is your role today? What did we hire you to do and ask you to do?
So my role was to evaluate how publicity about a case could shape potential jurors when they come in and sit on a panel, and to see if maybe people who were living in Latah County or have some connection to Latah County might potentially have more problems being objective because of media saturation and other issues.
Did you prepare a PowerPoint to help walk through what you have to share today?
Yes, I did.
I'm going to do my best to open that up. I am trying to find the right.
You just go to slideshow, right to the top, maybe 6 down to the right. One more to the right. And then on the left towards its front beginning.
Okay. I think we're there. Thank you for helping me through that.
Do this regularly. I'm teaching.
All right. I want to know if this is the background of the research on potential juror bias. What do you know about that?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of research on how publicity affects potential jurors. It says roughly 40 years. Really, it's been longer because in the 1960s, there were some high-profile cases, and so social scientists wondered, does it matter if there's a lot of publicity about a case? Could that potentially make jurors less objective? Could that influence actual outcomes in a case? And so the research started then, kind of trickled in, and then became more and more popular. And then in 1999, there were enough studies that somebody conducted what's called a meta-analysis. And another one was conducted in 2022, so it's nice to have a recent one. A meta-analysis is when you take a bunch of studies on the same topic and you statistically combine them into one giant study. So they do this in every field. They do this in medicine, every discipline, where you really want to know an overall effect of something. Because I might run a study on the effects of pretrial publicity and find maybe a small effect, and somebody else might find a big effect, and somebody else might find no effect. And it's hard to trust any one study with, a few dozen participants, or even if it's hundreds. I would want to see lots of studies. Just like if I were trying to decide if I want to take a medication, I don't want just one study that tells me it works or doesn't work if I have a serious illness or the medication has a serious risk. But I would be much more confident if there were a whole bunch of studies, dozens of studies combined, and thousands of participants' data. And so a meta-analysis basically does that. It narrows down a specific topic, in this case, the effects of pretrial publicity on judgments, and it examines overall, combined, is there an effect? And so there were, like I said, one is quite recent from 2022. So it's the simplest way to describe this research. It's the easiest way for somebody to know where it stands, even if they don't read all the articles. And what this work has found is that if somebody's exposed to publicity about a case, something about the defendant, something about the case, fact, fiction, that the tendency is, if you look at everything as a whole, for it to affect judgments, and specifically how much you like the defendant, your inclination to think that they're guilty, your judgments of their criminality, etc. And this has been shown with individual judgments of guilt, but even more so with group judgments, with juries. And it looks at participants who are randomly assigned to get pretrial publicity information or not, so that you can really determine cause effect. So this would be a formal experiment. We do lots of studies, and Experiments are the ones that I like to look at, because what you do is you hold everything constant except for one thing that you change. You get one people, one experience, another group of people, another experience, and then expose them to all the same things. So all the same trial stimulus materials. And you see, okay, the people who got some information ahead of time that they weren't supposed to pay attention to, did they evaluate the evidence differently? Did they come up with different judgments? And so the meta-analysis in 2022 is based on over 11,000 total participants, and it summed up the studies on that specific topic.
And the sum up, what was the sum up?
Yeah, essentially what's on the slide there are the main findings. The fact that if you get exposed to publicity, you're more likely to render a judgment of guilt and less likely to, or have lower liking for the defendant, and have higher ratings of their criminality.
Based on your years of teaching and work and understanding human bias, do you know why this happens?
Yes, if you don't mind advancing to the next slide, I have a couple sections here. One is on why we sort of soak up this pretrial publicity in the first place. And then the next section is on why that stays with us through a trial if we are to serve as jurors, even when we don't want it to stay with us. And so if I just start with the first topic, why is it that we soak this up in the first place? One reason is because of how we process information. Since the 80s, social psychologists have studied this model that suggests that it's pretty straightforward. Sometimes we think deeply about things and we scrutinize arguments and find flaws in them. And then sometimes we make quick decisions. We like decision shortcuts. And we only have so much cognitive capacity that the vast majority of our decisions and thought processes are more automatic. And we call this peripheral root processing when it involves an influence situation. So if you're making some kind of determination about something, whether you should purchase a certain car or vote for a certain political candidate or something like that, you can go through and you can analyze every single thing and try to be as objective as possible, or you can make a decision in 2 seconds. Oh, my neighbor has that car and they like it. And so the problem with peripheral processing is sometimes you're going to come to a conclusion that you wouldn't have come to before if you had thought about things more methodically, more systematically. And so the reason this applies here is because people, when they're consuming media, are often processing peripherally. Why? Because they might not be completely able to focus on a story, or they're scrolling quickly through a newsfeed. So if you're scrolling through a newsfeed or a social media feed, or if you're watching the news while you're cooking dinner or something like that, you're taking in information, but you're not able to really devote the resources cognitively to nitpick. And so you'll see something like Brian Kohberger arrested for the murder of 4 students, or you'll see something like this: among items taken from suspect, knives, guns. And automatically, when we're processing at the superficial level, which again, most of the time we're doing, we'll say, oh, okay, so they found the person who committed the crime and they have evidence. And we don't take it a step further. But if you actually stop and think, then you realize, oh, wait a minute, people get arrested all the time and it turns out they didn't commit a crime. Or, wait a minute, we all have knives in our homes, but we haven't all killed somebody. I have a lot of knives in my kitchen. A lot of households have guns. And so we don't take that extra step to really think deeply about things a lot of the time when we're consuming media.
It sounds like you're telling me that we're just absorbing information. And in Mr. Kohberger's case, from the media, people may take bits and pieces, and that starts to create a level of knowledge or human bias.
We might feel like we know about something more than we do, yeah.
Are there other ways that bias gets created?
Yes, and it looks like you advance to the next slide. So one thing that's relevant here, too, is listening to authority figures. So I mentioned that we're processing superficially a lot of the time, peripherally, and one readily available peripheral cue a lot of the time when it comes to this type of situation is hearing information from authority figures, people who have status or expertise, any kind of power, and we tend to listen more to people in those positions. And yes, a lot of the time they have more knowledge, but there are big problems with this. One is that we assume that they're accurate. We forget that they're humans too, that they make mistakes too, that they have biases too. Like if I'm in charge of trying to make a community feel safe by, arresting the right person for a crime, I have a motivation. I want to make sure, I want to convince myself maybe that, I've caught the right person. And, if I'm in that position, doesn't make me less biased, right? We all have biases. All humans have biases. And they also could be wrong. Like I said, people can get arrested for a crime when they didn't commit it. And what we found in research over many, many years, decades, is that if somebody has any kind of indicator of authority, even if it's something as minor as height, but certainly, an occupational status, title, that people will take their words so far that they'll do things to contradict their own morals, and they'll be influenced in areas beyond the person's expertise, like a doctor influencing you in your relationships or something that's totally irrelevant. And so we take it a little bit too far. And in the case of Moscow and Latah County, it's a really small community, right? And so the authority figures are often going to be people who are known and well trusted. And, so that makes this effect even potentially more problematic. And as you know, Chief Fry, the chief of the police at the time, had said that he was certain that he arrested the right suspect and he didn't have any doubts. And so the community would say, okay, well, the chief of police is sure, so then I can be sure too. But like I said, we can't assume, and there's no trial that had taken place yet. And so we can't assume that that's accurate information, but we tend to take that a little bit too much at face value.
The example that you gave of the police chief speaking out and offering what he thinks about a case, is that something that creates more bias in the minds of the Latah County residents that heard that?
Yeah, they're familiar with him. They know him to be an authority figure. They may know him personally or trust him personally. And so, yeah, somebody outside of Latah County, they'll still be affected by his authority status, but maybe not as much, right? And then he also has power over people in that community, and that seems to carry some weight when it comes to this type of influence. And then also, the president of University of Idaho saying, we can feel safe now, they found the person. It sounds very conclusive when there hadn't been a trial yet. And so another authority figure is pretty major in an area like Latah because so much is centered around the university.
Are there other ways that you found that create bias?
Yes, if you don't mind advancing to the next slide. This is a phenomenon that goes back maybe a century. We've been studying this in so many different contexts, tons and tons of research on this phenomenon called classical conditioning. And it's basically when we make associations between things and it causes us to have reactions that we didn't have before. Like, for example, if your alarm clock, we don't really have alarm clocks that much anymore, but if your alarm sound on your phone, if that's what you use, wakes you up this morning and you have kind of a negative response to it, it might be because you associated it with waking up before you wanted to. Before, I know I always try to choose a sound that I don't have an aversion to, but then it doesn't take long before now I have a negative reaction. So you make this connection, right? But if that same tone was used every time a loved one texted me, then I wouldn't develop an aversion. I might develop a favorable reaction. So classical conditioning is when we develop a response to a stimulus. It could be a sound, it could be any stimulus at all, including a person, because we've connected them with something that it has been paired with, especially repeated pairings. So in this particular case, if the defendant's name is seen throughout media and social media a lot, or his image is shown alongside things that are aversive, negative words, things like terror, murder, evil, or alongside known killers, alongside details of the murder, alongside information about, tragic consequences, things that make us feel bad. What happens is it doesn't take that many pairings, and then his name alone, which was once neutral, because most people wouldn't have known him, becomes conditioned, and it evokes those same kinds of feelings. And they've done studies like this where they can make this happen within minutes. If I could take a picture of any of you or multiple pictures of any of you, show those interspersed with pictures of other people, and at the same time present words, consciously or not consciously, that say things like terror and evil. And at the end of the study, I can ask people, what do you think of this person? And the rating will be lower. And so if you get that exposure a lot, like in Latah, where people are getting a lot of media exposure and also social media exposure and having a lot of discussions and attending, vigils, and they're really being exposed to kind of all these emotional reactions. If they're thinking about him at the same time, they can't help but make that connection, even if they don't think he's guilty.
Let me make sure I understand how big this is, how far-reaching this is. We've been with this case pending for a year and a half, and there's been, suffice to say, a lot of media coverage. There's a lot of pictures of Mr. Kohberger in the media. Do you mean that when we walk into trial and the room's full of potential jurors, there's going to be a great majority of them that before we sit down are going to have a feeling of bias against Mr. Kohberger?
Yeah, I do. And you've seen the pictures, these ominous headlines, and that connection can't help but be made.
That's all the way that bias gets created? Or do you have another one for us?
I have one more. As far as things that happen largely while the publicity is coming in and you're getting exposed to it. And it's sort of a category of a lot of different influences that are emotional and motivational. And this one, I think, is especially relevant to, sourcing people out of Latah County to be jurors. So the media played a role in inducing some emotions like it does. It likes to attract attention, things like fear and anger and sympathy and empathy. But in that community, people are going to have those emotions anyway from everything that's going on. But if the media uses phrases like killer on the loose, everybody stay vigilant, make sure you report all suspicious activity, then they're arousing that even more. And so what happens is when we have emotions like that, they filter in how we process information. Just like when you're angry, you're more likely to remember things that have made you angry in the past than things that have made you happy. And when you're angry, you're also more likely to have kind of an agenda with new information coming in. And so, for example, and this is something that could stay with somebody, this distorted information processing could stay with somebody and could get, there could be a resurgence during a trial where it keeps affecting somebody as they are reminded of their emotions. Because, they've associated moods with different judgments of guilt. Like, for example, if you're angrier, you tend to be more punitive and you want retribution. And in fact, in one study, they associated anger of mock jurors during a trial with support for imposing a death sentence for somebody. And they, when they were angry, they were less likely to pay attention to defense arguments. So people aren't trying to be biased. It's just that when we're in moods, those moods filter how we process information, how we take it in. And, I think I may have mentioned this already, but there's also kind of an emotional, motivational component to feel like the person who committed the crime is under arrest. It is the right person. I think I mentioned it as, being a motivation by the police, but the community has this motivation too in Latah because they were living in fear during all these weeks where they were trying to find somebody to arrest. And somebody was arrested and people could take a sigh of relief. But that sigh of relief assumes that he's guilty. And so we have this coping mechanism, basically, where we want to get rid of these negative emotions. And one way to do that is to feel like, oh, well, if he committed a crime and he's under arrest, then I can feel safe now. And so that's something that could come into play, too, if you live within the region where the event occurred.
And that's because of the fear that was associated with?
Any of the emotions really could potentially distort information processing. That last point relevant to fear, but a lot of research on how anger influences judgments and how sympathy for victims, empathy for victims influences judgments. And certainly if you are in Latah and have attended vigils or offered social support, that you're really getting a lot of that empathy and sympathy as well, or if you're exposed to the personal media stories about what happened.
So I think I understand the ways that the human bias just gets bigger and more solid in a person. What happens if we seat a Latah County jury and those biases aren't there? What happens as we put on the trial and evidence is presented?
Yeah, well, I mentioned this one can get carried through the trial, this idea of motivational and emotional sources. But there are other things that can happen during trial too that kind of exacerbate the problem. And one of these is confirmation bias. So this has to do with us wanting to confirm our expectations of things. And one of the most fundamental human needs we have is a need for predictability. You don't want to walk into this courtroom and feel like you have no idea what's going to happen. That's uncomfortable. We want to feel like we know what's going to happen. And we know how people are going to behave. And so part of this need for predictability is that it causes us to distort reality a little bit. And so in one way that this does this is through the confirmation bias, which is once we develop an expectation of something, once we decide that this is true, this is the case, or the defendant is guilty or not guilty, or the defendant lives a certain lifestyle or behaves a certain way, or has, then once we decide something, everything goes through that filter. I talked about an emotional filter. This is a cognitive filter that we actually process information differently based on what we expect to see and hear. It's just like if, you're going to meet up with a friend and you think somebody called your name, you expected it. And so it made you hear it even when it didn't happen. And if somebody does call your name, you hear it more readily. So we're kind of tuned in. And so the processes I mentioned here, this filtering can happen via 3 different processes. One is selective attention. So if I'm a juror and I have expectations about Mr. Kohberger, and it doesn't have to be just that he's guilty, but it could be expectations about him as a person. If I have expectations coming in and I'm getting all this new evidence during trial, going through that filter and paying attention to information that backs up my idea. Well, I had this idea that he's a bad guy, and this information backs that up, so I pay extra attention to that. And then they talked about something where he was kind to someone, and I really have to pay much attention to that. So we have this filter, and then we process information too in a distorted manner. We actually will change the information to fit in with what we think. It's just a way of our minds simplifying our worlds. And while these processes all help us not be overloaded cognitively, they distort what we take in. So we have to be aware of them. And recall is distorted as well. So, a trial takes place over a long period of time, potentially, and somebody has to remember a lot of information. And if they have distorted recall that's consistent with their expectations before coming in, that's obviously problematic.
Is that the only thing that happens when we have new information at trial?
No, I have a couple other things that I'd like to talk about. And the first one is belief perseverance, which is really a direct consequence of the confirmation bias. So it's just like it sounds. This is the tendency for our beliefs to persevere, even in the face of contradictory evidence. Confirmation bias supplies us with this filter. And because we have this filter, if somebody gives us all these facts that go against what we think, logically, we should just change our minds. A lot of the time we don't. In fact, there's some evidence to suggest that sometimes we even cling more closely to our beliefs. And anyone who's looked at anything on social media has probably seen evidence of this, where somebody has a strong belief about something and then somebody provides actual facts that contradict it. And then instead of saying, oh, you're right, I see your point. Of course, that can happen sometimes. The general tendency is for people to still stick with their beliefs anyway because they formed them. When you're in the process of forming your beliefs, that's different. But once you've formed something, it tends to stick. It's the same thing with stereotypes. Somebody has an assumption that elderly people are bad drivers, and they see a whole bunch of evidence suggesting otherwise, and even research studies and things like that. Then they no, I still think elderly people are bad drivers. So that's belief perseverance. And in some cases, people will even double down. Again, social media, they might even get more aggressively in line with their initial opinion after seeing evidence to the contrary. So this is one reason it's directly aligned with the confirmation bias.
It sounds like they can work together when somebody already has a bias. They've already made decisions about it.
Yeah, really any expectation or decision or judgment, even if you don't know that you have it. I heard the phrase of growing legs. Well, there's a famous social influence researcher who used that same phrase with decision making. Like once you've decided something, your decision grows legs of its own. And so now it's not just the normal information necessary that for any rational person, because we all kind of have this tendency to be irrational in situations like this, but it ends up causing us to distort reality a little bit, and we need a lot more evidence now than we should to change our minds.
What else impacts getting new information during the course of the trial?
We'll advance to the next slide. I want to mention a little bit about cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is an uncomfortable feeling we have when we have like an inner clash, like an inner hypocrisy, like if I'm religious, but I don't adhere to one thing about my religion, and there's this inner clash, and we don't like that feeling, and we like to reduce it, minimize it, prevent it. So why is that relevant here? Well, if somebody lives in Latah County, they might have a dissonance experience because if they start during trial to believe that, oh, maybe the defendant is innocent, maybe he shouldn't be convicted, that belief might be battling another belief about loyalty to their community because they know the community wants closure. They know that the community wants him to be guilty. They know the community wants to feel safe. And so they have this inner clash. And what happens when we have this inner clash, lots of things can happen. But one thing that could happen is we could distort reality. That's another reason for kind of being a little bit less accurate when taking in information. So if I'm if I'm a juror from Latah County, and I'm starting to kind of think, oh, maybe he didn't do it. There might be part of my brain convincing me that no, he's guilty because of this inner clash. I want to get rid of the clash.
Is that because of the loyalty a person would feel to Latah County, to their community?
I think that's a big part of it. And there could be other reasons with regard to community connections that could create that clash too.
Like a concern that they might be known who they are as a juror?
A concern that they might be known. They're this kind of picturing yourself sort of coming back to your community with the news that you were involved in a process that actually, acquitted somebody, for example, and having to face people in your community, which is something I touch on later a little bit too.
All right. Should we move forward?
Yeah.
All right. I know the court's going to want to know, can we fix this?
Sure.
Can we get our jurors in here and tell them, don't bring your bias in? Can we fix this? What do you think, knowing what you know about human bias?
I would love that to be the case. I just don't see that as feasible when bringing jurors out of Latah County. And I can tell you some problems with all the methods that people try to use. It's just, if you look at the research, there are limitations to these. And so one of them, of course, is juror selection. Let's try to find people, for example, who haven't been exposed to publicity. So there are problems with that. Can you recount all of the publicity that you've been exposed to? No. If I asked you to tell me about all of the interactions you had with people over the course of a week, you're going to have forgotten some, right? But doesn't mean they're not going to be affecting you. So maybe when I was at the grocery store, the person checking me out had a negative expression on their face, and I didn't recount that to you, but maybe that memory is there and it's buried. And when I go back in the grocery store, I'm a little colder to them. And another possibility too is that retrieval cues can make some of these unconscious memories actually become conscious, and maybe they affect us at that level. So if I'm a juror and I'm sitting in and hearing all of this evidence, something might remind me, oh yeah, and I remember they found this information, and maybe it's something that's not admissible, but now it's affecting me. And I didn't report that I knew that because I didn't remember that I knew it until something cued that up. And so that's a retrieval cue, is basically something that reminds you of what you know and can't articulate yet, or maybe don't have knowledge about it at a conscious level. And so there's a problem with that, picking people who haven't been as exposed to a case. And of course, in Latah, we talked about the saturation of media. It'd be hard to find somebody to even say that. But if they say that, I don't know if that really would be something we could rely on as being totally correct. And then this is something I focus a lot of my research on, and it's bias. So there's a lot of research on how we overestimate ourselves. We have overconfidence. We tend to rate ourselves as better than average, like better than average in intelligence. There's one study where the vast majority of people rated themselves as better than average drivers, but we can't all be better than average. It included people who had gotten into multiple car accidents. So while people might be thinking that they're making an accurate assessment of themselves, when they're asked, hey, do you have any bias, for or against the defendant? Do you have any, or are you capable of setting aside your bias? People probably often believe that they can set that bias aside because it's in line with all of this research that we know about how we tend to overestimate ourselves. So they're going to say they're less biased than they are. That's been shown over and over again in a lot of settings. And by the way, the people who are the most biased have the most distortion when they're estimating their bias in at least some cases that they've studied so far. That's some research I've done too. And then also they're going to be biased about how much bias they have. That's called the bias blind spot, which has been studied too. So I might acknowledge that other people might be biased, but I won't be biased, and I'll be capable of setting it aside. So that's one process, jury selection that we would hope would work, but there are a lot of drawbacks to it, so I wouldn't rely on that.
Do you think that it's less likely to work in a situation like this with the amount of negative media coverage that has been going on for a long time?
Yeah, if you ask somebody from Latah County to forget everything that they've heard about the case, forget all the discussions they've had, forget all of the media they've been exposed to, forget all the emotions that they've experienced, set all that aside. Can you really do that? Can you unhear things and unfeel things for an extended period of time to be objective? That's quite an undertaking. So yeah, I think that's problematic.
You mentioned extended period of time. This trial is projected to take 3 full months. Is that what you mean by extended period of time?
Yeah, really. The longer it is, the more potentially distortion there can be because your decision has grown legs and things are getting filtered through filters. And then emotional things can carry a little bit more longevity. So, so I wouldn't expect it to just go away if it's a long trial by any means, but I'd expect to see it in a short or long trial.
Is there anything else that can be attempted that might or might not work?
Yeah, my next slide is on instructions. And of course, people would want to try to give instructions to jurors to be unbiased. And like I said, people overestimate their ability to do this. They don't even think they're that biased to begin with. And the first step to not being influenced by bias is to acknowledge that you have bias. So there's already an obstacle there. And then you have to have the motivation to not be biased, and I hope jurors have that. You also have to have the cognitive capacity to be unbiased, and that's where we run into a lot of problems, because their cognitive capacity is going to be occupied by serving as a juror, paying attention to information. They don't have time to spend 80% of their mind, trying not to be biased and catching all the bias. And in fact, there's research that suggests that when we try to suppress thoughts, that we can think about them even more as soon as we let our guard down, which is very soon, because you have to think about other things at some point. So if I try not to think about something like an argument I had with somebody, or somebody tries not to think about cigarettes, but they're trying to quit smoking, they could do that for a really short amount of time. But as soon as they think about something else, their mind gets flooded with those thoughts. Because in order for you to not think about something, you have to think about it so that you can catch those thoughts. And that process is automatic. Most of what I've been talking about today is unconscious, automatic processing, and that's why it's so hard to control. And with regard to instructions to disregard information, whether it's something that people learned pre-trial or something they learned during trial that turns out to be inadmissible, the research shows that those instructions typically don't work, and sometimes they can backfire, partly because of this thought suppression rebound effect. And then there could be other reasons too, like people not wanting to be told how to think. And I mentioned too that, it applies to emotional information too. So factual and emotional pretrial publicity would still have influence even if people say, don't let this affect you. I wouldn't assume that works at all. unfortunately.
How about jury deliberation? Will that work if you have a juror in there who's going to maybe accidentally bring something in or interpret something based on something they'd heard before, or they've remembered something over the course of trial? Will the other jurors push it out, help them not to think about that? Will the group overcome that bias?
Yeah, so we would hope that you get a bunch of people together who are trying to be objective for them to sort of correct each other. And while some of that might happen, what the research has shown is if some people are exposed to pretrial publicity and some aren't, that can spread. Because you can't expect a juror to remember where they learned things. Like maybe they have information about DNA evidence and some of it came from trial and some of it didn't. And how do you disentangle that? That's really, really hard to do. And so they might spread it unintentionally. It might be spread intentionally too. But even if we're assuming perfect jurors here, it might spread unintentionally and then sort of contaminate the jurors during discussions. And then there's also this phenomenon we've been studying for a long time called group polarization, which is when you get a group of people and if they're leaning towards a particular opinion, when they discuss a topic, that opinion gets stronger and stronger the more they discuss it. Another thing you could see potentially on social media, like groups that, are invested in a particular issue. And so if the group is leaning towards negative judgments about Mr. Kohberger or judgments of guilt or anything, even a little bit, then discussions could actually make it worse and worse over time. It could get polarized. So I don't anticipate that discussions would fix the problem. In fact, I would expect it to exacerbate the problem. And that might be why in that meta-analysis I talked about, the effect of pretrial publicity was stronger when it came to group judgments, verdicts versus individual judgments of guilt.
Based on your years of teaching human bias and your extensive study of human bias, do you have an opinion about whether the extensive pretrial publicity has impacted the Latah County jury pool?
I do. I think it would be so hard to be a member of that community and be able to come in and be objective, arguably impossible. So we don't have a known method for undoing things, and the things have been done. They've felt the emotions, they've seen the publicity, they've had the discussions, they've been to the vigils, and even if they want to be as objective as possible, and even if we disregard some of the limitations I talked about before, research has not uncovered a way to undo this after it's there. And so the recommended best practice by the vast majority of researchers on this topic is find people who don't have that information, restrict that information in the first place. Find people who don't have that information. And the same goes for that emotional experience and investment and so on. Utilize jurors who've had less exposure, they have less reason for prejudgment, less motivation to find the defendant guilty. It doesn't affect them, their feelings of safety, the community. They don't have to worry about reporting back, and other people maybe ostracizing them if they didn't make the judgment that was expected or wanted. And so my recommendation would be to find a community to recruit jurors from that's as far removed from Latah as possible, physically and psychologically.
Thank you. I don't have any other questions for you, but if you hold on just a minute, I think Ms. Katie might. Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Taylor. Ms. Dave.
Your Honor. In any jurisdiction where there's been a tremendous amount of pretrial publicity, at least some of these biases would apply to a prospective jury pool, correct?
Yeah.
And the best thing, if I'm understanding your testimony correctly, for this trial would be to have a jury pool with the largest percentage of jurors who hadn't formed an opinion on this case already. Would that be fair to say?
I mean, you need, I can't speak to percentages. You need somehow to find enough people to serve on the jury who have not been exposed. Now, this is a high-profile case, so we know the exposure is all over the state, and of course, this is part of it. But if you can have less exposure, you have less bias potential.
In a case like this, where there's been so much exposure across all counties, are there unique challenges in selecting a jury that would apply anywhere?
So, well, I mentioned some unique things about Latah County and emotional investment in the community, concern for community members, and, having felt that fear and wanting, the defendant to be guilty so that they could resolve the fear and anger. So, there are all those emotional and social connections. And of course, Dr. Edelman's report, which will come up later, shows that a lot of people who live in Latah County are connected in some way to the university or the police involved in the case. So they actually, know people or they lived in Latah County. And so those kinds of things make, because it's such a small community, make Latah a unique experience.
And so you've reviewed Dr. Edelman's survey.
I have.
So does it sound correct that 75% of folks in Latah County are not affiliated with the university?
I don't recall his percentages.
Okay.
So offhand, I'd have to see the report. I could look at it if you'd like.
Okay. And I should be more precise. I believe the question was, are you or a family member a student or employee at the University of Idaho in Moscow? And the percentage of folks who responded no was 75%. Does that sound right?
I couldn't tell you without seeing it. Sorry, I don't remember.
Would it surprise you to find out that 60% of Latah County residents who were surveyed reported that they did not feel higher levels of stress or anxiety during the hunt for the killer in this case?
I don't know. I don't know what percentage I would have estimated. I just would have estimated it to be higher in Latah.
Okay. So is one strategy that the court could use in any jurisdiction, whether the trial stays in Latah County or moves to Ada County, would bringing in a larger jury pool alleviate some of these concerns across any jurisdiction?
Well, if we're talking about Latah County, a lot of the things that I mentioned were not in the survey. So, there are emotions I mentioned that weren't assessed during the survey, impressions of Mr. Kohberger that weren't in the survey. So it could be that 90% of people think he's a bad guy, but they don't think he's guilty. And then that still could influence judgment. So it's really hard to answer that question without, I didn't make the survey, and even if I did, there'd be a lot of things that I would miss too, so I can't make that determination about, you said maybe you can restate it and I can.
No, I appreciate the answer. Thank you. Now, I guess the last question I'll ask you is, would you be surprised to find out that in the survey, when jurors were asked, potential jurors who were responding to the survey were asked what their opinion is of Brian Kohberger, the highest percentage of prospective jurors that were surveyed who had no opinion of Mr. Kohberger were Latah County survey respondents? Would that surprise you?
That they have no opinion about whether he is guilty.
I think the question is just, do you have an opinion of Mr. Kohberger?
Well, it's a high-profile case that had a lot of coverage, and the percentages are so high that people who have an opinion, I imagine, I don't have those in front of me, but in statistics, we call that a ceiling effect when all the percentages are high and you can't really see differences. So I don't know if we're talking, I don't know what numbers you're looking at, but I don't know if that applies or not in this particular case. Thank
you. I have further questions.
Ms. J. Ms. Taylor, anything else?
Yes. Just a few questions for you.
This has been a special report from True Crime Today and the Hidden Killers podcast.